The ice-bound creature in the heart of the Arctic, where the wind howls like a beast and the snow stretches endlessly in all directions, a small group of scientists embarked on what was supposed to be a routine expedition. The world had never been more fascinated with the secrets the ice could hold, and these experts in ancient biology and climatology were no different. Their mission was to study the ice core samples, drilling deep into the frozen landscape to uncover secrets of the Earth's past. Little did they know, the ice held something far more dangerous than they could ever have imagined, something that had been waiting for centuries, frozen in time. The group consisted of 6 members: Dr. James Carter, the charismatic and headstrong leader; Dr. Lucy Williams, a climatologist known for her ability to predict and navigate the harshest of storms; Dr. Mark Reynolds, an archaeologist with a thirst for discovery; Dr. Abigail Pierce, an expert in ancient ecosystems; and 2 field technicians, Ben and Sarah. They had been preparing for months, organizing the latest drilling equipment and mapping out their route. Their goal was simple: retrieve samples, analyze the ancient ice layers, and understand the changes in the Earth's climate throughout history. The journey had been long and grueling, but they had finally reached their destination, an isolated part of the Arctic Circle, miles away from any signs of civilization. Their base camp, a sturdy research station with reinforced walls, was located near a glacier that seemed to stretch out of sight. A constant chill filled the air, a deep, biting cold that made every breath feel like a sharp stab. The wind was merciless, howling day and night, but the station was safe enough. The work had begun without hesitation. As the days passed, their progress was slow but steady. The drills sank deep into the ice, and the samples they pulled up were remarkable, revealing layers of ice dating back thousands of years. But it wasn't until Dr. Mark Reynolds noticed something odd in one of the deeper samples that the expedition would take a dark turn. The ice, at least 30 meters below the surface, was disturbed. A strange formation was embedded within it, unlike anything he had ever seen before. There was a vague outline of something large and elongated, its shape distorted by the layers of ice around it. Excited by the discovery, Dr. Reynolds insisted on investigating further. The team decided to conduct a more extensive excavation, careful not to damage the surrounding ice. They drilled a larger hole, using cutting-edge technology to remove the surrounding ice in the hopes of reaching whatever this ancient entity was. After days of hard work, they finally exposed the object, an enormous, twisted form that seemed impossibly large. It was coated in layers of ancient ice, with jagged spikes protruding from its surface like petrified bone. It wasn't an animal that they could identify. Its features were beyond anything they had seen in their studies. It had the appearance of a massive, serpentine creature, but with a strange and unsettling elegance. Its body was covered in scales that glistened even beneath the frozen layers. At first, the team assumed it was simply the remains of a prehistoric creature, perhaps an ancient reptile or some species they hadn't encountered in the fossil records. But there was something more, something wrong. The deeper they dug, the more they realized the creature wasn't dead. It was suspended in some sort of suspended animation, its form frozen in a grotesque display of frozen power. But why hadn't it decayed like the rest of the ancient beings that had long been fossilized in the Arctic's harsh cold? Dr. Carter and the others were hesitant to continue digging, but the lurid discovery was too great to ignore. They set up heaters around the site, intending to slowly thaw the ice in hopes of uncovering more details of the creature's origins. The deeper they thawed, the more it became apparent that this was no ordinary beast. It was something unnatural, something older than time itself. That night, as the team celebrated their progress in the warmth of the research station, the temperature outside plummeted further than it had ever gone before. The wind screeched, the pressure of the storm increasing, as if the very atmosphere around them had shifted. Something felt wrong, but they couldn't put their finger on it. They slept uneasily that night, the howling winds keeping them awake. The following morning, when they returned to the excavation site, they noticed something that chilled them to their bones. The creature was no longer frozen. In fact, it wasn't just thawed, it had begun to move. Its massive form, so grotesque and immense, twitched ever so slightly, the shadows around it seeming to shift as if it were breathing. Panic set in. The team quickly sealed off the excavation site, but it was already too late. That night, when the team members were in their station, the temperature outside dipped lower than it had ever been recorded. A freezing, unnatural cold enveloped the station, as if the creature had awakened from its icy prison. And then the disappearances began. Ben, one of the field technicians, was the first to go missing. He had been standing guard near the research station's front entrance when he heard something. Soft footsteps in the snow, an unnatural presence moving in the blizzard. He turned to see nothing but the swirling storm, but when he stepped back inside, he found the door to the station frozen shut from the outside. His breath quickened, a chill creeping down his spine. He turned, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to freeze. The last thing he heard before he vanished was a low, guttural growl coming from deep within the storm. The others searched frantically, but there was no sign of Ben. The storm intensified overnight, and the team was trapped in the station. As the temperatures dropped to unbearable lows, the sounds grew louder, the low growls, the scraping noises, like something dragging its heavy body across the ice. The team huddled together, terrified, but it was clear that the creature was out there, hunting them. The heavy breathing, like the exhale of a beast too large to comprehend, echoed through the walls of the station. One by one, they started to disappear. Dr. Lucy Williams was found frozen, her face contorted in terror, her body locked in an unnatural posture, as if she had been frozen in place. Dr. Abigail Pierce vanished without a trace, leaving only a trail of ice that led into the blizzard. The wind carried their screams into the void. By the time the creature reached the last of them, Dr. Carter and Dr. Mark Reynolds were the only survivors. They had barricaded themselves in the deepest part of the station, but the temperature had dropped to such extremes that even their breath turned to ice in the air. The creature's heavy steps grew closer with each passing hour, a slow, deliberate march through the walls of the station. The thing was not merely alive. It was ancient, bound to the ice in ways the scientists could never understand. It had been waiting for centuries, frozen in time, and now that it was free, it was hunting to feed, using the freezing cold to freeze its victims before consuming their warmth. It had no concept of mercy, only hunger. Dr. Carter turned to Dr. Reynolds, their last hope fading with each passing minute. "We need to destroy it," he whispered, his voice shaking. But it was too late. The creature had already found them. The last thing they heard was the echoing howl of the wind and the deep, guttural growl of the beast as it closed in, ready to claim them as its next victims. The storm raged on outside the station, but inside, all was silent. The creature, freed from its icy prison, had finally fed, and the Arctic returned to its frozen, desolate state, where the only reminder of what had happened was the ghostly, frozen remains of those who had dared to awaken it. Next story. The cabin in the snowstorm. It had seemed like the perfect getaway. A quiet weekend in the woods, away from the constant noise of the city. The Thompson family, David, a successful but stressed lawyer, his wife, Rachel, who had recently quit her job to focus on the family, and their two children, Ethan, a 16-year-old who had grown distant from his parents, and Lily, their 10-year-old daughter with an infectious curiosity, had rented a secluded cabin deep in the mountains, far away from civilization. They hoped to reconnect, take a break from their hectic lives, and spend some much-needed quality time together. The road to the cabin was long and winding, the winter weather already beginning to show signs of an approaching storm. But they had made it, and with the first flurries of snow beginning to fall, they unloaded their bags and made themselves at home. The cabin was rustic with dark wooden beams and old furniture, but it had a certain charm that made it seem cozy. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the snow outside fell heavily, enveloping the world in a thick blanket of white. It felt peaceful, almost magical, at least for the first few hours. By nightfall, however, The storm had grown fiercer, and what had started as light snow quickly turned into a raging blizzard. The wind howled outside, and the cabin began to creak under the pressure. It wasn't long before the family realized that the roads were impassable. No one was going anywhere until the storm passed. For the moment, they were stuck. David, trying to make the best of it, suggested they settle in and play some board games by the fire. Rachel agreed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. It wasn't the storm or the isolation that made her uneasy, but the cabin itself. There was a strange energy to it, an inexplicable sense of heaviness in the air. She tried to push the feeling away, telling herself it was just nerves from the storm. But as they ate dinner and settled down for the evening, her unease grew. Ethan had already retreated to his room upstairs, absorbed in his phone as usual, but Lily was fascinated by the cabin. She had wandered around, exploring every corner, as children tend to do. It wasn't until she discovered a narrow door at the back of the cabin, hidden behind an old wooden shelf, that she truly began to feel the strange pull of the house. She called to her parents, but when they came to see, the door was already shut. "Lily, you shouldn't go opening doors like that," Rachel said, trying to hide her growing concern. But Lily was persistent, her innocent curiosity leading her to places her parents would never dream of. As the night wore on, the storm grew worse, and the cabin seemed to feel colder with every passing hour. The snow had begun to pile up against the windows, obscuring the view outside. The only light came from the flickering fire in the hearth. It was David who first noticed the marks on the wall. He was in the living room, sitting with Rachel, when he glanced up at the wall near the back door. There, faint but unmistakable, were deep scratches, lines gouged into the wood, as if something or someone had clawed at the surface in desperation. Rachel turned pale when she saw them, the air between them suddenly thick with the feeling of dread that had been creeping up on her all night. But they both dismissed it as nothing more than the result of old wood settling in the house. That was until they heard the noise. A loud thud came from the floor above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps shuffling slowly. David jumped up, his heart racing, thinking that Ethan had come downstairs. But when he went to check, Ethan's room was empty. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Panic gripped Rachel's chest as she called out for him, but there was no response. Suddenly, the temperature in the cabin plummeted, a cold that sank into their bones, even with the fire crackling. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls, stretching unnaturally. Then came the sound, the low moaning, as though 1,000 voices were whispering in unison. The wind outside howled louder than ever, and the snow began to pound against the windows. "Where is he?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. They searched the house, calling out for Ethan, but there was no sign of him. That was when they heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor above. They rushed upstairs, their footsteps heavy on the old wooden boards. They reached the hallway at the top of the stairs, and David's heart skipped a beat when he noticed the door at the far end of the hall. The same door Lily had opened earlier. It was now shut tight, as if someone had been there, but there was no sign of Ethan. Lily stood there, staring at the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it, sweetie?" Rachel asked, her voice desperate. Lily didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the door with a trembling hand. "They're in there," she whispered. David, with no other choice, pushed the door open, his breath catching in his throat as he stepped inside. What they found inside the room sent chills through their bodies. The walls were covered in the same scratch marks they had seen downstairs, but they were deeper, more frantic, as if someone had tried to escape. The air felt thick with something dark, and in the corner of the room a small, decaying wooden chest sat ominously. Rachel reached for it, her fingers trembling, but as soon as her hand touched the chest, the entire room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and a guttural sound filled the room, like the groan of a heavy, unseen presence. Then came the voices, Help us. The whisper was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But as the whispers grew louder, they realized these weren't just voices. They were the voices of the past, the tortured spirits of those who had once lived in the very place the cabin had been built upon. It was then that they knew the truth. The cabin had been constructed over the ruins of an old asylum, abandoned for decades. In the 1800s, the asylum had been a place of horror and abuse, where the mentally ill were subjected to cruel treatments and left to rot away in the dark. It was said that the spirits of those forgotten souls still haunted the area, bound to the land in torment. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the cabin seemed to come alive. The walls rattled as the temperature plummeted further, their breath visible in the freezing air. Rachel screamed as a cold hand brushed against her cheek, but when she turned, there was no one there. She turned to David, but his face had gone pale, his eyes wide with terror. And then they saw him, Ethan, standing in the doorway, his eyes hollow and glazed, as though something had taken over him. Behind him, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, twisting into figures, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces. "Daddy," Ethan whispered, but his voice wasn't his own. It was a low, tortured rasp. "Mommy, help me." The whispers grew louder, and the figures moved closer. It was clear now. Ethan had become a vessel for the restless souls, bound to this place, just as they had been. Desperately, David tried to pull him away, but it was too late. The spirits, angered and vengeful, reached out and took Ethan. In that moment, the family was trapped. The blizzard outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the storm of fury that had been unleashed within the cabin. As the temperature continued to drop, the spirits of the asylum's former residents closed in, their whispers growing louder, their icy fingers tightening around them. The family would never leave the cabin, and every winter after that, the blizzards would return, just as they always had. The cabin, now abandoned and decaying, would remain standing, a testament to the forgotten horrors that lay beneath the snow, the whispers of the lost souls trapped forever in the cold, whispering for the next family to come. Next story. The last train to nowhere. The night was bitterly cold as the last train of the evening chugged through the snow-covered mountains. It was a small, weathered train, its old wooden cars creaking with every turn of the tracks, a relic of a bygone era. The snowstorm outside had intensified, and the swirling flurries turned the dark night into a vast, empty void. Inside, the passengers sat huddled in their seats, wrapped in coats, scarves, and blankets, hoping to reach their destinations before the worst of the storm arrived. Among them was Victor, a young journalist traveling home after a late-night assignment in the city. He had boarded the train without much thought, just another routine journey through the mountains. He was tired, his mind heavy with the stress of work and his personal life, and he simply wanted to sleep through the ride. But the moment he stepped aboard, something about the train felt wrong. The lights flickered as the train began its journey, casting long, eerie shadows across the worn-out upholstery. The air inside was unusually cold for such an old train, and the muffled sound of the snowstorm outside seemed to press in, amplifying the stillness inside the car. As the train clattered along the tracks, Victor glanced around. There were a few other passengers, an elderly couple sitting quietly across from him, a middle-aged man with his face buried in a book, and a woman with large, dark sunglasses who appeared to be deep in thought. Victor settled into his seat, trying to focus on the quiet rhythm of the train's movement. But it wasn't long before he began to notice something strange. The elderly couple had not moved or spoken since the train had left the station, their bodies unnaturally still, as though frozen in place. The man with the book had his head slumped forward, his hands still gripping the pages, but he wasn't reading anymore. His eyes were closed, and his breathing had become shallow, almost imperceptible. Victor's unease grew, but he tried to shake it off. It was just the stress of the long day, he reasoned. That's when he heard it, soft whispers, almost too faint to make out. He turned to the woman with the dark sunglasses, who was now sitting motionless, her hands folded in her lap. The whispers seemed to emanate from her, though her lips didn't move. As he stared at her, a chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, the train lurched, and the lights above flickered out completely, plunging the car into darkness. The sound of the blizzard outside intensified, a howling wind that rattled the windows. In the brief moment of complete silence that followed, Victor felt the temperature inside the train drop drastically. His breath came out in visible clouds, and he could see the outlines of the other passengers in the dim light, their faces pale and blank, their eyes wide with an expression of resignation. The train started moving again, but it wasn't until the next stop that the real horror began. The conductor, a tall man with an expression that was both kind and unnerving, entered the car and announced that they would be making a brief stop. The door slid open with an eerie screech, and the wind rushed inside, carrying with it a swirl of snowflakes. A few passengers exited, seemingly without hesitation, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. But as the doors closed again, something felt wrong. The elderly couple, who had not moved at all during the journey, were now gone. Only their empty seats remained. Victor stood up, a sense of dread settling in his gut. He made his way toward the conductor, his mind racing with questions. "Excuse me," Victor said, his voice barely rising above the howling wind. "Where did the elderly couple go?" The conductor turned to him, his face eerily calm, his eyes dark and unwavering. "They've moved on," the conductor said, his tone soft, as if the words themselves carried some unspoken weight. "Everyone who gets on this train eventually moves on." Victor blinked, confused. "What do you mean? Where did they go?" The conductor only smiled faintly, his expression almost pitying. "This train is bound to the mountains. It picks up souls along the way. It's taking them to where they belong." Victor's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? This is insane. Are you telling me they're dead?" The conductor didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Victor standing there, his mind spinning. Victor returned to his seat, still feeling a sense of unease settle deep in his chest. As the train continued its journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't stop staring at the empty seats where the elderly couple had been, and as the train's dim lights flickered again, he noticed something else. More passengers were missing. The middle-aged man with the book had disappeared, his seat now empty, and the woman with the sunglasses. She was gone too, her seat now a vacant hollow space. But their belongings were still there, coats, bags, and purses, all left behind. Victor's heart raced as he stood up again, his mind desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. He rushed down the narrow aisles, passing empty seats, looking for any sign of the passengers. But there was nothing. It wasn't until the next stop that Victor found the truth. The train came to a slow, eerie halt in the middle of the snow-covered wilderness. The conductor's voice came over the intercom, announcing the stop in a calm, detached tone. "This is your destination. You've arrived," the voice said. Victor's blood ran cold as he stood at the door, looking out at the bleak, desolate landscape. Snow piled up against the tracks, and the wind whipped the snowflakes into a blinding flurry. But there was no sign of any town or station, just the endless, snow-covered mountains, stretching into the horizon. "What's going on?" Victor demanded, turning to the conductor. The conductor's face was now a mask of indifference, as though he had seen it all before. "This is where the train ends. This is where all passengers are bound. You can't leave," he said softly. "The train doesn't stop. It doesn't return. Once you're on it, there's no getting off." Victor stumbled back, his mind reeling with the impossible truth. The train wasn't a train at all. It was a vessel, cursed to travel the snowy mountains forever, collecting souls at each stop, ferrying them to some unknown destination. The doors slid open, and Victor was suddenly overcome with the realization that he was the last passenger left. The other passengers, Those who had boarded with him were gone, spirits trapped in a cycle they could never escape. The train was a trap, a twisted purgatory for those who had died in the snow, doomed to ride it until the end of time. And as Victor stood there, frozen in terror, the train began moving again, the wheels creaking along the tracks as it began its journey into the unknown, carrying the souls of the dead, each one adding another layer to its cursed history.